Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Latterly podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Baloo. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens.
We are honored to have Dr. James Hollis on the podcast today with us. Jim is one of the most published living Jungians with a total of 16 books to his name, and he is presently a licensed Jungian analyst in private practice in Washington, D.C. He was trained at the Jung Institute of Zurich and for many years served as executive director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston and executive director of the Jung Society of Washington. Needless to say, he's made some incredible contributions to the field. Dr. Hollis, Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
I actually first encountered your work reading your book, The Eden Project in Search of the Magical Other. It was published in 1998, but I encountered it many years after in my adult life. Tackles relationships and disentangling fantasy from reality. I think that would be a great topic to get to later on. It might be helpful for our audience first to learn a little bit more about you and the Jungian approach in general. So maybe we can start by exploring where you were at in your life at 35 years of age when you went through what some might consider a midlife crisis. We have a lot of listeners around that age that might be going through something similar right now. So if you could tell us a little bit about those years and how that led to the path you're on now, we'd love to explore that.
Okay, well, I would say at 35, I'd achieved everything I wanted in my life, and I felt depressed. So you've got a problem right there. That's a discrepancy. And the discrepancy was coming from deep within me because no one chooses to be depressed, of course. Mm-hmm. And naturally, our first reflex is, well, how quickly do I get rid of this? How do I divert that? Do I take a medication? What 5 easy steps to this or that? Well, it reluctantly took me at age 35 to my first hours of analysis in Philadelphia. And I began to explore what was my life about? What was the journey? You know, we spend the whole first half of life reporting to the world, to our parents, to the school teacher, to our employers, to relationships, commitments of all kinds. And to the best of our ability, we're out there trying to adapt, adjust, fit in, and, quote, be successful, whatever that means. And then we have to ask a question. Now, if I've done that more or less, where do I go now? And in service to what? And what's the whole second half of life about? So you could say the journey of the first half of life is a social agenda, you and the world, and what the world's asking of you. Can you mobilize, assemble enough sort of ego strength and commitment and courage at times to deal with the world as it is? And the second half of life, the question is quite different. And that is, so why am I still here? What is it that my life is about as opposed to someone else's? Is it all about fitting in and then someday you die? And that becomes a kind of spiritual agenda. What is the value of my life? What really matters? Or another question, what is wanting to enter the world through me, which is not something that we normally think of as young people. It's all about sort of coping with whatever the expectations are we have around us, even if we have our own ambitions. What wants to enter the world through me? That's a different story and a different accounting. And then I began to realize as I got deeper and deeper into it, I had to ask the question, why has my psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the places that I and my culture have invested all of my energies? You know, I worked hard to achieve certain goals and achieved them all. And then I had to say, so why is the psyche not cooperating? I don't think I'd put it in those terms, but that was the real discrepancy. And I would say that was the beginning of second half of life, which meant if we're out there sort of responding to the outer all the time and pay no attention to the inner, then we're going to be creatures of the fate into which we've been thrown, a set of circumstances and demands and so forth. And we certainly all have to deal with that. But then you have to ask yourself, but who am I apart from my roles? Who am I apart from my sort of functions in life? Who am I apart from my resume? And then the journey gets interesting.
Yeah.
And then it begins potentially to become your journey, generated from something inside of you, as opposed to responding only to whatever the incoming messages and challenges are.
Hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, and you've talked about sort of separating the noise from the signal and how there is a lot of inner traffic in all of our minds. It can be hard to determine which part of you is pointing you in an authentic direction. So how do you think about if you're at that point in life where you are depressed, you realize something isn't working, you need a change, identifying what that change needs to be and what the new path should look like?
hmm Well, for me, I think for many people, you don't know automatically what's calling you, what you're really needing to address in your life, but you have to stick with it. It's a process of tolerating that in between. And the in between time can be several years, as a matter of fact.
Mm.
You're sort of really working with this issue of discernment. Discernment is an old fashioned word, but we need it today. Discernment means from the immense traffic that's going on constantly, either around us and coming to us or intrapsychically barraging us. Which voices are coming from your own depths? Which voices are coming from your soul? Which are the ones that are the complexes of your achieved history that are noisily demanding your allegiance? And which are outer responses that may be legitimate in their claim upon you, such as in relationship and so forth? So that's a process that goes on forever. And yet you do have to realize there's something inside of each of us that always knows what's right for us. We knew it better as children, and it was called instinct, perhaps. But because we're tiny, vulnerable, and dependent, we have to trade it away. And then you have to say, all right, what is it in me that knows more than I know? What is it that's monitoring my heart, my cellular exchange? What's producing my dreams at night? What's caused this depression in my case? And that's when I began to understand there has to be a dialogue with something going on inside of us. And there are many ways we can do this, but one of which is working with our dreams and so forth.
Mm.
So, Dr. Hollis, you mentioned discernment a moment ago. What would you say is the process for actually testing that out? Because going back to that noise analogy, I know you've mentioned it, like we've all pictured busy airports. We've all been in busy airports and we know how much traffic there is, but there's maybe 10 times more traffic going on in our minds and in ourselves. So when you think about discernment, what's the process that we should think about as it relates to testing that noise and which one to follow?
Mm-hmm. Well, several thoughts. Good question. To some degree, when we know what is right for us, and when we hit on that area of our life, often there's something that resonates for us. We feel that sort of inner confirmation, if you will. But you may not have permission for that. You may be frightened of that, because that might call for significant change in your life, significant risk.
Right.
But we are always equipped with certain elemental functions. For example, and this sounds so elementary that I hesitate to tell you, but it's at the core of things. We don't choose feelings. Feelings are autonomous, qualitative analyses of our experience by something inside of us. Now, consciously, we can reject them, we can project them onto others, we can anesthetize them, we can be caught up in them, whatever. But if you stop and say, all right, let's say I'm doing all the right things. Is my feeling function supporting me? Does it feel right? Because many times, if you do what you're really meant to be doing, the feeling function will support you. And if it's not there, that's important to pay attention to over time. Secondly, energy systems. When you're doing what's right for you, the energy's there. You can mobilize energy. Thank goodness we have to. You get up in the middle of the night to feed a baby, show up to work on time, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
But, ultimately, you try to push your energy around and it'll lead to burnout and depression, self-medication, and so forth. So when you're doing what's right for you, the energy is there. Thirdly, we dream, as I mentioned, about 6 times per night. And I know most people say, well, I don't remember that many dreams. Few people do, but you have to ask, why has nature created this phenomenon whereby our psyche is talking to us that sort of compulsively and with such consistency? Nature doesn't
Right.
waste energy. And if you pay attention to your dreams over time, you begin to notice some threads there. And then you realize I didn't create the dream from an ego standpoint. It's my dream. I can't deny that. My third grade teacher's in it, so you didn't give it to me. What's she doing in my life? Why has she come up here? You see? And I can say more about that later if you want.
Sure.
And then fourthly, most of all, and most elusive, but most profound is the question of meaning. If what you're doing with your life is meaningful to you, something supports you. If it's not meaningful, you can put all of your effort into it. You can be supported by people around you. You can be paid a lot for it. Something inside is always missing. And again, meaning is not defined by anybody's standards, personal standards. It's a question of what speaks most deeply to you. And nobody can tell you what's meaningful in your life. That's why I said at age 30, plus or minus, I'd achieved all of my conscious goals. I had nothing wrong in my life that I could discern. And yet I had this depression. And therefore I had to ask, why is that there? Why has it come? What is the psyche saying to me? And it ultimately led me to not only some years of personal analysis, but of traveling to Switzerland to be retrained. I was originally an academic professor in the humanities and went through over a period of years a complete retraining and left academia, although I continue to be a teacher up to this day, and to spend my life working with the human psyche, mine and others. And, all the learning that was so rich and so valuable in the first half of life is still germane. But I had to ask, but where's it coming from really? And what's it really in service to? That's a different question, because we all get caught up in the topical aspects of life and our schedules and the things we have to report to. But underneath, you have to say, but what's really going on here? What is this about?
Right.
What does this touch in my history? And what's consistent with my own life purpose? Those are different kinds of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times people are driven towards specific aims by their complexes or their neurosis without realizing that that's the driving force. So maybe you could explain what those are and how those formulate and kind of how to separate that noise from the signal that is authentic feeling and authentic meaning.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I often suggest to people a very basic question about anything that they have some real doubts about, such as a choice they're making or not making, or a certain behavior, a certain relationship, whatever. What is that? Where's that coming from inside of you, really? Can you track that back into? Because we're full of rationalizations, and rationalizations justify our reflexive conditioned responses. That's why I say you can't trust your first responses. You have to say, what's that in service to really? And you can go back to it and you find, well, that's really coming from a place in me that fears conflict. Or that's a place that's coming from me that is afraid of being alone, let's say. Well, there's nothing wrong with that fear. It's part of being a human to have that fear. The question is, how much sovereignty are you going to give that in your life? Is that going to make the decisions for you? In which case, you better know it, because it's going to be a whole different career path, a whole different relational path that comes out of that. Also, to ask the question of choices in our lives. Whenever you reach a juncture, does this path enlarge me? Does it diminish me? We usually intuitively know the answer to that question. Ask yourself in any decision, from whence did that spring? Where have I been here before? And that's when you begin. See, we usually don't question these things, so we're pretty much on automatic pilot. And that's what complexes do. The word complex is a neutral word, like apartment complex, airport complex. It's a structure. But life gives us experiences, clusters of energy. You have an experience of your mother, you have experience of your father, you have experience of your dog, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those experiences get messaged somehow. They're quantities of energy that are carried within us. Some part of our psyche remembers all of this, which is why your third grade teacher can show up in today's dream, even though you may not have seen her for decades. She's not lost. And the question is, why has she come? Why has central casting reached out to her to come into my present psychodrama going on here?
Yeah.
And then you begin to realize, well, there are other forces, other processes at work intrapsychically. So these are the ways you begin to realize we all have shadow governments. And our shadow governments basically run our lives. And I've often said to people, the first place to start, you don't have to necessarily see a therapist for this. First place to start are with your patterns. You don't rise in the morning, look in the mirror while brushing your teeth and say, well, today I'm going to do the same counterproductive and stupid things that I've done for decades. But there's a chance that you will. Why? Because there are these sort of conditioned responses, these complexes. And they will be the complexes that were acquired in, the honesty of your life experience. So, as I said, that a lot of your behavior could be built around the fear of conflict with others, fear of need to sort of curry favor with others, fear of being alone, fear of being punished, fears that are understandable, but you can't turn your life over to them. That's the point. And fears that maybe to the child were too large and maybe overwhelming, acquire an enormous amount of energy and show up in intimate relationships. They show up at work. They show up in your incapacity to trust yourself and so forth. So if we don't ask these questions, this is not navel gazing. This is not self-indulgence. It's really saying, all right, what's really making my choices in life? Isn't that an important question to be asking from time to time?
Absolutely.
And if I realize then, all right, there's an awful lot of sort of activity going on inside of me of which I was unaware, then that's the beginning of sorting through to move from a kind of received authority that culture gives us, the family of origin gives us, to a personal authority. Mm. And the personal authority is the single biggest project the second half of life, meaning by that simply, as I sort through that traffic we referenced, which voices are mine? And now do I have the courage to live them? Because if I don't live them, then it's all a waste. And I haven't been here somehow. Because at the end of the journey, if we're in the proverbial deathbed, you look back on your life, you say, everybody makes mistakes and screw ups. And you say, well, I wish I'd have done that differently. But you also have to say, did I show up in the best way I could? Doesn't mean I was affluent, doesn't mean I was famous. It doesn't mean I was, quote, successful, whatever that means. Did I show up as me from time to time, at least? And that's a tough question to ask at that late stage. It's pretty hard to do much about it then.
Yeah.
So it sounds like our experiences are required for our life story. And then as we examine our life story, we can examine the patterns. And then as we examine our patterns, we realize that we may not be as present as we think we are. So it sounds like that pursuit of meaning, especially in the second half of your life, really could be exactly what is required to be more present.
Absolutely. That's very well said. Absolutely. Because those patterns are coming out of some, quote, logical place. One of the things our complexes do is they try to interpret the world. We're the animal that wants to understand what happened and why, and what does it mean. So if I'm a child and I receive a certain kind of treatment from a parent, I don't have the rational understanding, the big picture to understand, well, my mother's depressed because this is happening in her life, or father is worn out by this or that. And I interpret everything that happened as being about me, as a kind of cosmic statement about the world and about me. And so that's how I story that. We have to make story here a verb, not a noun. It's our effort to generate a narrative that helps make sense of our experience. You say. Let me give you a simple example. When my daughter was a toddler many years ago, I was still on a university campus, and we went to an end of the school year picnic. And the president of the university had a big shepherd dog, a big white shepherd, and he was playful, and he sort of knocked my daughter down, and she fell over a hill when falling down the hill. The dog was playfully sort of running after her, but she was probably 2. For her, It was an utterly traumatic experience.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and it was like being eaten by a monster, you
Yeah.
know? And she was just terrified. And so her story was essentially at that moment, as a 2-year-old, animal equals threat to your survival. And from that point on, for a few weeks, any animal she saw, like a dog, a cat, a squirrel, she would start screaming. It was very traumatic for her. And the only way that we could deal with that was we finally bought her a little dog, like the size of my shoe, and obviously at toy level, was not threatening.
Yeah.
And dogs grow, as you know. And today she lives near Dallas and has 4 dogs. So the
Nice.
point is, she had a story about that. The story was inaccurate. Most of our stories are inaccurate, but they're the ones we have.
Mhm.
And we look at the world through those lenses. We serve those scripts, and that's what produces the patterns in our lives. That's why you could set off in a certain direction for, let's say, Berlin, in your airplane. If you're off a few degrees, you wind up in Africa or China. So
Yeah.
depending on what stories you have operative in your life, then you realize, all right, these are part of that shadow government we were talking about, which is why self-examination, which sort of doesn't seem to be a natural tendency for most people, becomes critical, because if I don't, those clusters of energy are eating my lunch. They're making my decisions for me, creating my patterns, perhaps damaging me and the people with whom I interact. And that raises a huge ethical question about what I owe other people.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like the longer you let those negative clusters of energy fester, the more energy they gather. So if your daughter was to have avoided animals all throughout childhood, by the time she got to adulthood, that fear would have kind of seemed legitimate by virtue of all the years she spent avoiding them. So I think there's something to be said for trying to tackle your fears and your aversions as soon as possible once you identify them, as not to let them grow to a monster, so to speak, that's bigger than you can manage to slay.
Absolutely. Yeah. In other words, we didn't cancel her experience. That's not even possible. We sort of outpaced it by a better experience. You see. Let me give you another example. Just occurred to me. Now, this is my daughter as a mother. Speaking now of a grandchild. Many children will have what's called monster dreams. They're like typically around 4 years old. And her son, Nicholas, would just be terrified in the middle of the night. He'd had a big monster in his dream. And, rational conversation with a child only goes so far. And so she went to the store and came back with an aerosol spray can. And the label had been changed. And sure enough, if you read it carefully, it said monster spray. So she went around with her son and ceremoniously sprayed the corners of his bedroom.
Nice.
And the monster didn't come back. It was amazing.
That's perfect.
She gave a bigger story. I really congratulated her. I thought that was brilliant. She gave a bigger story to her son than his fears, because monster dreams are pretty common for children that age. When they realize, if you will, metaphorically, the monstrous nature of life is so huge, you're not strong enough to deal with it when you're 3 and 4 years old. It's overwhelming. Everything's overwhelming at some level, and so that's what the dreams were really about. But frankly, mother's ingenuity gave a better story, and that's how you don't solve these things in the sense they're gone. They're never gone. You outgrow them. You see.
That's very interesting and timely. I know there's a lot of folks listening that have just had babies. And so if that ever happens for them, they now have a little tip. But a question for you, Jim, because you're talking about patterns and we're talking about stories, I can't help but not think about addiction, right? So why do so many of us turn to addiction? And my question is addiction just a habit? And if that's true, then does that mean that we've actually lost control of being conscious? Because what I'm trying to say is that most of the time when a habit is formed, you don't necessarily have to think about it. You just kind of do the task. And when I take that one step further, to me, that sounds like you've lost control of being conscious because you're just like, oh, I'm going to do the task. It's just part of my routine. It's become a habit. You're not really thinking about it. So can we talk a little bit about addiction there?
Well, it's a very good question again. First of all, I think everybody has some addictive patterns. And by that, I'm going to define it in the most sort of generic way possible. Addictive patterns are reflexive responses to things that would cause stress. You don't have to think about it. It takes over and at least temporarily gives you the illusion that your stress level is reduced. Now, another way of looking at this is in a more serious addiction where there are consequences to or costs to one's addiction. You realize, all right, it's by making a connection with something that stress level is reduced. Now, I'll give you a silly example. Let's just say the room that you're in is filling with water and you're in a watertight room. And let's say, just to make up an example, you light up a cigarette and the water goes down. For whatever reason, well, you link them together. And after a while, you start utilizing that, especially if it happens more than once.
Right.
And after a while, that becomes essential to how you manage your anxiety. Now, just imagine that anxiety is like water rising. You don't have to know that it's happened for the behavior to take over. So there are large areas of a person's functional personality is often addictive in character. And when I said all of us have addictions of some kind, let me give you an example. Possibly the greatest addiction is habit. We all have habituated behaviors because habit gives us a sense that the uncontrollable nature of life is under our control.
Right.
Notice that people get upset when the newspaper is not there in the morning, or the traffic's heavier than you thought and you're going to be late for an appointment. The level of stress goes straight up. And then you realize, okay, my habit now is my effort to impose upon the chaos and unpredictability of life some expectation, some pattern of control, you see. But basically, addictions are management systems that ultimately wind up controlling the person who's trying to control something else. And the enemy is always anxiety. You know, in my profession, the enemy is always anxiety. Not that we can avoid being anxious. That's not possible. But the question is, what does anxiety make you do? What does your anxiety keep you from doing? And our defenses against that become addictive, whether we think about them as addictions or not.
So life, at least the forces coming at us from the external world, are very chaotic, and we're doing our best to try to order those forces and, bring some semblance of like structure to our lives and the way we structure our time. How do you think about the challenge that's inherent in every life of having to navigate a world that you, in some sense, have very little control over? It's hard to predict where it will go, what will be thrown at you, while we have this really, really deep-seated instinct to want to be able to order our reality and order ourselves. It seems like there's a conflict there that we're constantly trying to navigate as individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. That conflict will always be there. And many times people think, well, if I get this all figured out, if I have the right religious faith, or if I have the right set of practices in the outer world, if I read the right book, I walk into the sunlit meadow where that anxiety is gone. Well, that never happens. The only non-anxious people are basically psychotics or people who are drugged out. And, there's a cost for both of those treatment plans. So anxiety is part of the currency of life. Anxiety is the price of the ticket to life. If you want to be in life, you're going to have to deal with anxieties. The question is always the pragmatic question. And what does that anxiety make you do? What does it keep you from doing? Now, again, if what you're doing is meaningful, that's a story, so to speak, larger than your anxiety. Now, to give you a very practical example, I'm a card-carrying introvert, but a good part of my life is public speaking and so forth. And the way I deal with that is if I thought everybody's up there to have a critical opinion of me, that's enough to sort of shrivel any sense of your calling to do that kind of work.
Right.
I simply say, hey, this is not about you, stupid. This is about what is it you've learned along the way that might be helpful to people who are struggling to make sense of their own lives. If you think this is useful, why wouldn't you share it? I have that
Yeah.
little talk with myself before every public occasion, because it puts the ego to the side there and says, all right, this is something you're supposed to be doing with your life. Are you going to let your anxiety keep you from doing it? The answer is clearly no. It's not about you. It's about, what's bringing us together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned ego there briefly. Now we've hit on, at this point, soul, psyche, ego. The ego gets a bad rap a lot. I think in modern times, it's seen as something that can be selfish, self-interested. It kind of deludes us into thinking we're more important than we are. But in the Jungian school of thought, I think the ego plays a very important role in our overall psychical structures. Could you tell us a little bit about how Jung conceptualized the ego and how you work with maybe even your patients' egos in a constructive way in your practice?
Certainly, very good questions, gentlemen. First of all, the ego is itself a cluster of energy. It's one complex among many here that we have. And it's tasked with very important functions. It's our interface with the external world. Your ego says, oh, that car is coming toward me, so I'll step back to the curb. The ego says, oh, you just got burned when you touched that iron, didn't you? I guess you need to be mindful of that in the future. So the ego's function in the outer world is to interface and, preserve this organism so you don't step in the way of the car or walk right up to the tiger. But the ego is very malleable, very invadable. And we're only in our pure ego state from time to time in the course of any given day. So, for example, if you step in a shower in the morning and it's too hot and too cold, you make an adjustment with the water. And that's the ego in relationship to the external world in an appropriate fashion. But from that point on, the ego is often flooded with material. And because a lot of that material is unconscious, we literally don't know we're sort of possessed creatures, so to speak. The ego is most of the time driving under the influence of the complex. And where the ego gets into the problems that you were referencing here is when it thinks it's the boss, thinks it's in charge, arrogates to itself a power it doesn't have. And our psychological term for that is inflation. The ancient word was hubris, where I think I'm the boss, where I think that I'm in charge of the universe. Well, guess what? The universe is going to creep up on you and convince you otherwise pretty clearly. So the ego is essentially, in its best sense, a tool to interface with the external world. And in addition, I should add, the ego is in charge of values and choices. If you're going to make choices, by what values do you live? And if you don't, you can be sure your complexes are doing it for you. And once again, what spills into the world may not be what you want to do with your life or who you wish to be as a person.
Right. It's like the world wants you to do one thing, your ego wants you to do another thing, and then your internal psyche is actually saying, well, hold on, let's see what we really want here.
That's right. And then let me just say, that's where we started. At midlife, my ego had done its assignment well, but the psyche revolted. That was the contradiction. Right. And I think that happens in everybody's life to some degree. And that's when you have to stop and pay attention. You have to then say, but what does the psyche want? And psyche is the Greek word, the ancient word for soul. We're really talking about the essence of the person, the core. You are behaviors, you are cognitive processes, you are biological functions. All of that's true. But you put it together, you don't have the full human being. There's something that we call soul. We mean simply the core or essence of that person. So my core, my essence revolted from the good job my ego had done. But I didn't know, I couldn't know at the time my ego had been under the influence of, complexes from family of origin, complexes from the culture, and so forth.
Interesting. And at that point, it seems like a whole new value system can actually be created. So have you seen in your work over the course of your experience in life, people actually have like brand new value systems all of a sudden at age 35 or age 40? Or is there always going to be something that you can't really let go of?
Well, I think it's both. As I said, the past is never really gone. As Faulkner put it, one of his characters, the past isn't dead. It's not even past. So we're wrong to think that something that's happened in our past or some value is missing, because the right thing will trigger it. You can count on that. You see it all the time. On the other hand, certainly our values can grow and change. For example, there may be times in one's formative stages of life where fitting in becomes more important to you than anything else because of the natural insecurity of the child. And later on, you realize what the cost of that was. And that meant some large opportunities in your life passed you by. And you realize, I can't afford to fit in that sense. I have to step out on my own. And if I do that, there's risk, there is anxiety, but at the same time, this is how I find my own journey as opposed to living someone else's journey.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked about dreams a couple of times now as well, in the context of figuring out a more, authentic journey for yourself. If you're in a situation where you are a very vivid dreamer, you can recall your dreams. Let's say you have a very upsetting dream. There's symbols in there or people in there from your life that you can very clearly identify. If you were to sort of write it down and get the story on a piece of paper, what would your advice be to someone looking to dig in and find a solution that may be hidden in those symbols and in that narrative that played out while you were sleeping?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first of all, nature is not planning to deceive us. It speaks a language that is nature's language, and we need to sort of learn that. Secondly, too often the ego tries to reassert its position by saying, oh, I know what that's about. It was on the news last night. Well, your psyche has no investment in talking about what was on the news last night, except as a scavenger, it may pull up some imagery from that in service to some other issue that's going on in your life. So the key thing then is to start asking associations with each of those images. Let me just back up one bit here. Sleep research tells us we dream 6 times per night. Nobody remembers that many, but that's 42 a week? That's a lot of activity.
Yeah.
And when you reach 80 years old, as I am now, 6 years of your entire life will be spent dreaming, which is really hard to imagine.
Wow.
But that's what sleep researchers indicated. 6 years.
Wow.
So your psyche is obviously processing things, whether you pay attention or not. Secondly, it has a point of view. And its point of view is not here to necessarily make you comfortable, not necessarily to make you fit in, but it is speaking the truth of your own soul, speaking the truth of your nature. That's the point. And, in a world of fugitives, the person going the right direction will appear to be running away, as T.S. Eliot wrote once. That many times the call of a person's own soul will occasion that they leave the collective and go out on their own journey, so to speak. Not narcissistically, but in service to something profound that is summoning them. Most of the people that you would revere in history didn't have comfortable lives. They had lives that were meaningful because something that was true for them. They served with a fidelity and often paid for that. But we value them, we honor them, because that service has contributed to our lives in some way, but also, it's a life then of integrity. Because integrity means about integrating these things. We're just not caught up in these split off aspects of our experience, such as the complexes are, that govern, as I said, silently, and create the patterns that are, imprisoning a person with the stories that were there at the beginning. If, for example, if my early experience says every time I open my mouth, I pay for it in some way, well, then I start abridging my own capacity to speak myself and move forward a few decades and see how that's self-defeating, you see. And we all have those.
So if our psyche is like poking at us and trying to get our attention in these dreams, and then we see these images, how do we actually assign our own authentic self to that, or our own uniqueness to it?
Well, I don't know that we assign it. I think we have to learn to open to it.
Okay.
There will be things in our dreams, as I said, that will challenge us, call our opinions into question, maybe poke some of our defenses.
Okay.
This work is humbling. It doesn't make you feel great. It's humbling because you realize, oh, here's something else that I wasn't aware of that was running my show, you see. But isn't it important to know that? Because
Absolutely.
otherwise we're captives of prison, of the past, rather. And one is, living perhaps a fugitive life and not realizing.
Interesting. Yeah, and I would think dream analysis sits within the realm of inner work of turning inward and trying to determine all the things we've talked about over the course of this episode, instead of sort of staying on whatever the beaten path was in your outer existence. One question I really wanted to ask you goes back to an experience that the highly regarded Jungian author Robert A. Johnson had with Jung himself. Jung, in some dream analysis with Johnson, told him that he should put all of his attention and hopes on his inner world, and that it would take care of him. He told him not to join anything, not to marry, not to spend any energy in the outer world. He didn't have to get somewhere, and that even if he never accomplished anything in his life, he would still make his contribution to the world in that inner manner. That was really interesting for me when I heard Johnson reflect on that, because that advice runs so counter to how we think about success and making a contribution to society. So as someone like yourself who has done a lot of inner work and has also contributed in a very meaningful way in the outer world by virtue of your practice and your books and your public appearances, what are your thoughts on living like Jung suggested Robert Johnson should, with such a heavy overweight to the inner world, that maybe the cost of that outer existence?
Sure. Well, that question's not really answerable because we don't know what Johnson presented to Jung to have Jung apparently respond that way. I from all we know is what Johnson's quoting sometime afterwards. And it's hard to imagine, frankly, as a therapist, someone being that directive, saying, don't do this, don't do that, kind of thing. But it's quite possible what Jung was really saying was the cultivation, your relationship to your inner world is probably going to be the chief preoccupation of your life. It's going to be what your journey is about. Now, the fact that we're talking about him was that wasn't wholly true, because he wrote a great many books.
Right. Yeah.
That made, the complexities of this thing very accessible to people.
Mm-hmm.
So I could imagine, though, I'm sure there are people whose souls are meant to be living so completely in that inner world that they might be living outside of society, for example, or might be in a monastic life or something like that. And it's right for them, but it wouldn't be right for someone else. Generally speaking, the key is balance. The claims of the outer world upon all of us, as we well know, are so immense that we're taken away from ourselves all the time, which is why I and others have to emphasize at times the importance of the inner life, simply as a kind of compensation for the claims of the outer world, because we can live all of our life responding to whatever the incoming may be. As a matter of fact, much in our culture contributes to that. The chief contribution of popular culture today is distraction.
Yeah.
What is it we're being distracted from, right? From our own inner life, from our own, still small voice in the wilderness, as it were. And Jung wrote once, and this is a sentence that haunts me every day in a constructive way, and I pass it on to you. He said, we all need to know what supports us when nothing supports us.
Oh, wow.
You see, and life is sooner or later going to smack you in the face. Life is going to break your heart at some point. Life is going to hurt you and disappoint you. Life's going to let you down. Now, what carries you through those difficult times? The last book I wrote was called Living Between Worlds. It was both cultural change and deep personal change. And underneath all of that was the question, what supports you when the old structures don't support you?
It's interesting because I feel like society and the institutions and just everything that we go through from childhood through adulthood, we're being distracted, I think, by our natural curiosity. Like we have a natural curiosity. We have a natural desire to figure things out or learn new things. But over the course of life, that kind of just gets chipped away, chipped away, chipped away. So I think that's what we're distracted by. And then ultimately, you get to a point where like, I'm not feeling fulfilled. I might even be feeling super bored at this point. And that's just because you haven't been engaging with your inner natural desires.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, that sensory overload really does dull at some level. And I've said to many folks in analysis, this won't solve your problems, but it gives you a far more interesting life. Anybody who's out there solving your problems is basically going to have superficial solutions to superficial problems. Life is not simple; it's complex, and something that worked today won't tomorrow. So just count on that. But your life's going to be more interesting because you realize every day there's something up for grabs. I put it in a book called The Middle Passage many years ago. When we wake in the morning, whether we pay attention or not, there are two gremlins at the foot of the bed. One is called fear and one's called lethargy. Fear is that part of ourselves that says it's too big for you out there. You can't handle it. It's too much. Lethargy says, chill out, hold the blanket over your head, have some chocolate, turn on the telly. And those two gremlins, no matter what you do today, they're going to be there tomorrow morning. And they're the enemies of life. And your meaning of your life will depend on the degree to which you wrestled some of your own life away from these two guys. And they are intrapsychic. We carry them everywhere. Move to Toledo, they're there. Move to Seattle, they're there. Fear and lethargy, those are the enemies of the life force. And we have them, all of us. The question is, if I'm not conscious of that struggle, then how in the world am I going to step into this journey that I call my life? In another book, I talked about my motto, and it's only 6 words. You're welcome to use them if you want. The words are, I say to myself every morning, silently usually, but I say them: shut up, suit up, show up. Shut up tells me, no, stop whining. You're tired, you hurt, so what? You don't have real problems. There are people who have no food. There are people who have no roof over their head. There are people whose children are being murdered. You don't have any problems, so shut up. Get up and get out of bed. Secondly, suit up. Prepare yourself. Do your homework. Pay for it. If you want something, go pay for it. And thirdly, show up. Just do the best, not show off. Show up means do the best you can in the face of the obstacles, external and internal, that life has put in your way. And if you do that, your life is rich and fulfilling. If you do that, your life matters to you. If you do that, your life is your life and not borrowed from somebody else.
I love that. That's fascinating. And Jim, over the course of this conversation, you've referenced not only your books, but other authors and other great thinkers. So what are you reading right now? I mean, who do you keep coming back to in terms of the literature or the mythology that, you're trying to understand even deeper?
Well, I usually let people's dreams or some case example lead me to what I'll call clinical reading. That's important to stay in contact, in touch with things. But I mostly read good novels and history, not other psychology. Because if you really want to see the timeless in the human story, that's where you're going to find it. I say good novels, meaning they're not just for escapism, but because there's some exploration of character and the interaction between character and fate that occurs, out of which comes the meaning of that journey. So reading psychology was the easy part. In fact, most modern psychology is just too mechanistic for my taste. So I've always found that, works of the imagination are far better guides to the sort of permutations of the human soul than, clinical literature ever is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Are there any modern authors that you think can really paint a rich, vivid picture of humanity and reality in a way that there's something to be gleaned from it? Or are you turning the clock back and, visiting some of the more classical authors from the last few hundred years?
Well, I usually try to read the classics. I mean, I'm not against reading something contemporary. I do, but what's fascinating is I think virtually everything that's happening in our culture today, you can find in ancient Greek tragedy. I really can. Where you have fate that sets things in motion, but you also have another energy called destiny that is seeking its expression through you. And right there in the middle is the human being making choices. Now, out of what values, what complexes, what drives is he or she making those choices? And so you see how those things interact in a fascinating drama. And that's true for all of our lives. You don't get to choose your family of origin. You don't get to choose your genetics. They are the givens. They're playing out in your life, whether you know it or not, at all times. But you are also in some way a possible future, something that's wanting to be unfolded. And there you are, and buffeted in all directions. And which of those forces are you most serving? You can't deny fate, but are you serving your own destiny? That's different than, say, career success, for example, building your resume, something like that. The question is, all right, can I see in those ancient traditions something I can learn from? And I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes, absolutely. Because the human condition hasn't changed. Human psyche has not changed. We have essentially the same psyche that was here thousands of years ago. Technology's changed. Social structures have changed. Social values have changed. Of course, but human nature has not changed. The evidence is in the text, always.
Wow.
So true. I mean, like, it's so true because regardless of all the things that are so transient, I mean, you still have those same basic feelings of like anger, for example. Like you could be like a hot-headed man and, you could read like Stoic, Marcus Aurelius from, way back in the day, like 160 AD, and he's talking about how to control your hot head. And so you're right. Like,
yes, of course. Well, the subtitle of the Iliad is The Wrath of Achilles, and it shows how his combination of unexamined pride and his capacity to be possessed by anger dominated his life and led to the ruin of many people around him. There's a perfect example of that inflation that comes from the flush of certainty that occurs to us in the states of possession by pride and so forth. And you could just go on through the text and realize over and over and over that character is, in a sense, how we respond to these forces in our life. We have certain inherent tendencies, but we also have certain choices we can make. And through what lenses or what story forms are we making our choices? If I don't reflect on that, then I'm at the mercy of what has been given to me. That's one of the reasons why, not to belabor a previous point, we pay attention to symptoms and dreams, the feeling function, etc., because those are correctives coming from within, from my own depths. That's not the complexes speaking. And that when I pay attention to that, then I'm in contact with some kind of other authority that sees my world, sees me in it, has its own point of view, and is seeking to communicate with me. And when I think about that, then it's less mystifying and more inviting. Wouldn't it make sense to pay attention to that once in a while? I think we did as children, but then, as I said, it gets lost in the noise of the outer world and the adaptations we all have to make.
And maybe a nice segue into the Eden Project, which I would be remiss not to touch on, would be the question: what kinds of relationships should you seek to have with others that can bring that healthy, authentic part of yourself out? And what types of relationships should we think about trying to avoid, or what behaviors, at least in relationships, should we think about trying to avoid?
Well, that's a tough question. First of all, I don't know anybody over 40 or over 30 probably who doesn't have some regret about a relational choice they made somewhere, and who says, what was I thinking, or what did I do there? Or what do I need to learn from that? The reason I call it the Eden Project is there's a piece in us that's there from childhood. Remember, where do we start in life? Connected to the heartbeat of the universe. And then at the birth process, we're traumatically separated from that other that met all of our needs. And we're thrown into this world, tiny, vulnerable, dependent, at the mercy of things. So the baby would climb back inside if it could, but it can't.
Yeah.
There's some archaic part of everybody's psyche that wants to merge with that other. That's what the whole fantasy of romance feeds, is the idea of finding that magical other who's going to fix your life for you, be your perfect partner, and be there all the time. And frankly, if you pursue it long enough, what it's really looking for is the good parent who's going to take care of you. And people wouldn't say that because that would be embarrassing. But underneath it, that's what sort of the search is about. And to the degree that that would happen would mean, okay, then you remain a child. You're not living your life at all. So when it comes to relationship, what is it that I can reasonably ask from another person? Well, I think you can ask truthfulness, fidelity, reciprocity, things of that sort, certainly. But the key thing that other brings to us, though, is their otherness. Because how do we grow except insofar as we engage the otherness of the other? And by engaging it and incorporating it, I am enlarged as a result of that. That's why we have education. That's why we value travel. You get to have the experience of that other that now enlarges my sense of self and my capacity for values and choices and so forth. So most relationships have a regressive and a progressive dimension. The regressive one is the one we've referenced, and that is the desire to sort of find that person who's going to make my life work for me. Well, guess what? I found that person. It's me, not my partner. And we have to ask what I would consider a useful and healthy question. What am I asking of my partner or of any other that I need to address for myself? Let's just take self-worth, for example. Self-worth is something important for most people, or everybody to some degree, and many people have some difficulties there. If I'm counting on my partner to make me feel good about me, then I am either controlling or I'm constantly frustrated with that other person. I need to say, well, you don't want to be partnered with someone who's denigrating you, for sure. But on the other hand, that's my job. I care for my partner by lifting that off of her shoulders. I take that on. I'm responsible for my emotional well-being, not the other. And if I've lifted that off, I've freed our relationship of some baggage. And I can, ironically, have a greater sense of that reciprocity and support that comes from being with another person.
I would find that that is so true, but I think people struggle because they don't even know their own fulfillment needs, let alone the other person's fulfillment needs. And so there's work that's required there to be able to get to that point.
That's right. And it's not even just human partnerships. We expect things from our careers. We expect things from institutional affiliations or ideological associations.
Right.
That's why this generic question, I think, is a helpful one. What am I asking the other that ought to really be my responsibility to address? If I do that, and I think it's a loving thing to do, you lift that off of the shoulders of the other.
Who am I that this is happening to me is another way maybe to think about it.
Maybe, certainly.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I remember not to be too kind of trite here, but I remember a line from Cool Runnings, which was a movie I watched a lot in childhood, where I think John Candy's character is telling one of the younger characters who's participating in the bobsled Olympics that if you're not enough without the gold medal, you'll never be enough with it. So you can't, to your point, rely on external success or external validation, whatever it may be, to take the place of whatever it is we're searching for in terms of that some kind of self-acceptance.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And that's why most often people feel betrayed somewhere around midlife. It's all right, if I meet this person and I commit to that person, if I engage investorly in this career, when I do X, Y, and Z, then I'm going to feel okay about myself, right?
Right.
Well, probably not. Right?
Mm.
What's unfinished is typically something intrapsychic. And that's why, again, if you recognize that that's your project, you lift off of these other things and unburden them, you have a kind of more realistic summons to your own accountability. I am responsible for my own journey, my well-being. Now, I hope that I have friends and partners and others along the way who wish to be reciprocal. But anytime, because the power complex infiltrates most relationships, as we know,
Yeah.
and it's like when the other is not doing what I expect from the other, and what I expect may be only partly conscious, then I wind up in passive aggressive behavior, controlling behaviors, or whatever. And that's when things get really sticky in relationships. If we value relationships so much, why do so many end up in, trouble, broken, bitter, etc.? And it's true in relationship to the projections, the fantasies, the expectations we had going into it, that were by and large unconscious and evasive of our own personal accountability.
Mm. It just goes to show that you're accountable for all the things that you are doing, and in a way, you're also accountable for all the things that you're not doing.
That's
and so you have to look at both parts of that. And it's
excuse me, that's what it means to be a grown-up. In other words, a grown-up is not just a big body and big roles. It means I'm a grown-up when I realize I'm accountable for everything that keeps spilling into the world through me, or the things I'm blocking from personal expression. And that's what it means to be an adult. And that's why there's so few adults around. Lots of people with big bodies and big roles. But the flight from accountability is stunning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And as I've heard you say this, it's now one of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung around life is just a short pause between two great mysteries. And to think that all of this is happening in this little short pause, it's really a pretty humbling experience in existence.
Very humbling, very humbling. And it is a very short pause, and it's your pause. So what are you going to do with it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour. The one thing I wanted to ask you before we close out here, Jim, is I wanted to learn a little bit about your new project. I know you have a documentary film coming out in the near future. It looks like tentatively titled Soul Heal. Can you tell us a little bit about the thrust of that project?
Well, as it happens too, today, which happens to be February 1st, 2021, is the publication day of a new book called Prisms, which is 11 essays on various subjects, from comedy to evil to aging and so forth. And it's available from today onward, and simply called Prisms, Reflections on this journey we call our life. And secondly, the film Soul Heal, we hope to have finished in the next couple of months, is really examining the splintered souls of modern men who've lost a sense of what it means to be a man, who either overcompensate in machoism or feel furtive, guilty, and somehow afraid of life, and to try to address what happens if a man, the way I've put it with women is this: women's groups who've asked me to talk about those strange animals called men. Imagine three things. First of all, that you have all your close friends cut away from your life forever. That is to say, those who, with whom you can share your marriage, your children, your fears, your own body, et cetera, et cetera. Those conversations are gone. When men get together, they'll talk about sports or politics or whatever, but those conversations are out of your life. Secondly, you must sever the link between you, your ego, and whatever has been the guiding source for you, whether it's your body, your instinct, your intuition, whatever you want to call it. And thirdly, your worth as a person will depend primarily on meeting external standards of productivity defined by total strangers you'll never meet. And if you can imagine those three things, you'll be a man in terms of the messages to men. Because what's missing there is any relationship to the inner life. And therefore, because I have no relationship to the inner life, I can't have true relationships with other men. And therefore, I can't have relationships with women either. So it's a film in which we're trying to explore some of the male tapes that we're all exposed to, and how one has to be able to turn within and begin to cultivate to some kind of conversation with what you and I have been talking about today.
Wow. Well, I will definitely be tuning into that when it's released. I can't thank you enough, Jim. It's been an incredibly fascinating conversation. It's been an incredibly useful conversation. I know Arjun and I both took away so much that we'll bring into our lives, and I imagine our listeners will as well. So really, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. You two fellows are very impressive. You've had very thoughtful questions, and I've enjoyed being with you, truly. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.